Good evening. Good evening, welcome. I'm Matthew Spaulding. I'm Associate Vice President and Dean of Educational Programs for Hillsdale College here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Alan P. Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. Hillsdale, of course, is in Michigan, but this is our campus here in Washington, D.C. And I welcome all of you to a great discussion tonight about a new book out, the Unmasking the Administrative State, The Crisis of American Politics in the 21st Century, by John Marini. Professor Marini is a professor of political science at the University of Nevada at Reno, and he has written extensively on this topic for quite some time in various books and publications, including what I consider a great classic, The Politics of Budget Control, Congress, the Presidency, and the Growth of the Administrative State. And he did some of that work, I'm happy to say, when he was here as a distinguished resident fellow at the Kirby Center. He's going to be interviewed by Michael Anton. Michael is a lecturer and research fellow here at the Kirby Center with Hillsdale College, and he was previously a national security official in the Trump administration. He writes extensively and appears regularly on television as a commentator, but he teaches here, our undergraduates here in DC, and also he will be involved in the Graduate School of Government we are currently planning to launch soon here in Washington, DC. If you're interested in that, speak with me or Andrew Heim, who's in the back. Both John Marini and Michael Anton are senior fellows at the Claremont Institute. John Marini is on the board of the Claremont Institute. Michael actually has recently reviewed John's book in the Claremont Review of Books. The Claremont Institute is also a co-sponsor of this evening's conversation, and we thank them for that. So with that, I turn it over to Michael Anton.
Thank you.
Michael.
The review that Matt mentioned, I noticed went online today, so everybody, as soon as you get home, click it, read it. I encourage that. I was going to say, I was here for a while, John, before you showed up, and I was about to make an announcement. I said, look, if Marini doesn't come, it's fine. I can speak on his behalf. I've been studying him for 25 years. I know the book really well. I know what his ideas are. I can even get up and switch back and forth between chairs and ask myself questions. But he came, so I think it worked out. I just want to tell a story. It's not a knee slapper, but it might be mildly amusing, about the first time I met John, and I've never told him this. So it was 25 years ago. I was a Publius Fellow of the Claremont Institute in Claremont, California. It was a small crew. There were only 4 of us. And the program introduces you to a wide range of teachers, most of whom, if not all of whom, received a sort of similar education, the same books, the same ideas, the same principles, one of them, of course, being John Marini. And I didn't know him. Honestly, sorry to say, I'd never heard of you at that point. So the 4 of us, we it's in a kind of a nondescript conference room at an office building in a suburb of Los Angeles, and we heard John Marini talk about this mystifying thing called the administrative state for about 2 hours. And Hegel, I'd heard of Hegel. Comte, who? And these names just flying around, and all 4 of us stumbled out into the bright Southern California sunlight with one sort of reaction amongst the 4 of us, which we whispered because we didn't want to be overheard by the people running the program. 2 of them are sitting right over there, by the way. And we said to ourselves, what on earth was that all about? We just didn't get it. My first experience was kind of mystification. Obviously, that was deep and profound, but what was it really about? I will say, I later encouraged and recommended and wrote a letter to a friend of mine to do a similar program down the road 12 years later. His experience on first hearing Marini was entirely different. This is because he's smarter than I am. He called me as soon as it was over, and he said, wow, that was the most impressive thing I've ever heard. I said, oh, you understood it like right off the bat. He says, oh yeah, instantly. I got it just like that. I mean, you didn't? Actually, no, I didn't. But I think I got it now. It took a while. I had to study up and really read and pay attention because Marini is, it's dense. His ideas are dense. The prose is dense. There's a lot going on. So let's get to what is going on. I guess I want to ask you, now the book is called Unmasking the Administrative State, which is not a phrase that you coined.
No.
And yet you have done more than anybody to popularize it, make it known, and to explain what it really means. So what in your education led you to make that what I think is fair to say, the primary focus of your scholarly efforts?
I think when I started back almost 40 years ago, at least 40 years ago, the administrative state was not a term that was used at that time. It was really not in the popular language, and not even in the scholarly language in the 70s when I first started. I probably started working on this stuff about 1975, 74. And what I called it then, what I was interested in was the phenomenon of what Tocqueville called centralized administration, because that was the term that we thought about as the culmination of what happens when a regime becomes dominated really by the administrative authority that is established, which at that time, I didn't know the theoretical background of how to understand what the authority for the administrative state was, because I hadn't done any study of the political theorists. Finally, I started studying Hegel. And Hegel describes this better than anyone in terms of what it's really about. And he doesn't call it the administrative state. He calls it the rational state. It's the rule of organized or rational knowledge. And so, but when I first started it, centralized administration was, I understood, from the point of view of Tocqueville. And Tocqueville said, this is what despotism will look like in democratic times. Centralized administration is democratic despotism. And his argument in the second volume of Democracy in America was, keep your institutions decentralized as much as you can. Political and administrative authority has to be decentralized throughout particularly a big regime. And once you centralize, very difficult ever to decentralize. So his chapters on democratic despotism, which were written between 1835 and 1840, are very revealing about this phenomenon, even before it had a name, either in terms of bureaucracy wasn't a widely used word even in French in Tocqueville's time. Hegel doesn't use it at all. So the administrative state, the bureaucratic state, whatever you want to call it, what distinguishes it in my mind is the authority that moves from political rule to administrative rule, which is a transition from political rule on behalf of the people, or political rule in which the people participate in their own self-rule, to rational rule, which is ruled by organized intelligence, organized knowledge. And now when Hegel established the goal of how it is that rational authority is going to be established within what comes to be known as the bureaucracy, he didn't quite know or have a method of establishing how that knowledge is going to be generated. Knowledge in the administrative state or the rational state is produced as it's created to solve the problems that exist in each particular epoch. And in establishing that, what he's doing, what the state is, the idea of the state, is a vehicle for the administration of progress. And the mechanism for establishing the knowledge as to how to bring about progress about is the bureaucracy. Now I'm using these terms as we would now use them. So the bureaucracy, although bureaucracy was a term that really means just rule of the desks in French, what was required to solve the problems of politics, of society, what was required to do that, of course, was knowledge. But there was no method by which you could establish rational knowledge. There were no social sciences yet. So Hegel did not, he established what the role of bureaucracy was to manufacture or produce organized knowledge or intelligence on behalf of the solution to problems that arise at the end of history when politics essentially is over. And in a certain way, religion is over. The big problems are over, and they should be replaced by administration. which will be a technical problem, and religion by the secular deity, as Hegel calls it, the state itself. Because the state is not merely a rational organization, it's also going to be an ethical organization. So all of these are brought together in that thought. Now, when Michael talks about Comte, and I'm not talking about Immanuel Kant, I'm talking about Auguste Comte, he was the man who established the social science discipline, the means by which to generate knowledge. So all of the social sciences really are born at the end of the 19th century with the demise of both philosophic and religious authority. Philosophic and religious authority is being diminished by the end of the 19th century, and scientific authority has replaced it, rational scientific knowledge. And so this administrative state doesn't come back into the usage of modern political science until the end of the 20th century. Now, at the end of the 19th century, the state itself as a concept, the Hegelian concept, was absolutely essential to the development of political science. Woodrow Wilson wrote a book on the state. They all talked about the state, and they meant the state conceptually in Hegel's terms. So I don't want to get too far into that. Maybe I should let Mike play both parts.
Yeah, let me ask sort of in the middle of what you said that the authoritative factor for this is organized intelligence or knowledge, and I'm going to put those both in scare quotes, right?
Yeah.
Because to what extent is that intelligence genuine intelligence that supersedes philosophic intelligence, and to what extent is the alleged knowledge actually knowledge? I mean, I know my answer is in neither cases did it work out as promised, but I'd like to hear your...
Well, think about it for a minute. The great hope for social science was that philosophic and religious authority had thousands of years to solve the human problems of poverty, disease, crime. Every expectation at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century of the progressives was, if we use science, the scientific method, and we establish knowledge about these social problems in the form of the new disciplines that are being established in the social science. You have sociology that was established. You have the social science, economics was a social science, anthropology, history, political science. Those were all brand new attempts to establish a theoretical, or let me put it this way, they were meant to be the applied sciences of the modern state. The state was the mechanism and the vehicle for the administration of progress, but you needed a mechanism to produce the knowledge. And so the question you ask, which is, I think, becoming more difficult to suggest that the knowledge that is established theoretically about practical things, in my view, is suspect now. Because I don't know that it produces what is genuine knowledge, because in the older traditions, practical knowledge was never understood theoretically. It was through theoretical or metaphysical reason. It was always understood in terms of prudence or practical reason. And that meant that you dealt with these problems that revealed themselves through the ordinary senses that one has to make sense of the experience. So commonsensical knowledge was practical knowledge, and it did not have a theoretical component. But all the social sciences establish a theoretical lens by which to understand practical knowledge. And the question then becomes a question of whether or not the method itself reveals reality or distorts reality. And I've come to think that it's more of a distortion of reality. If it cannot make sense, if it does not make sense of what the phenomenon actually is in terms of whether it succeeds or not.
There's a sense I get when I study this that economics, other social sciences, they have a sort of an envy in a way of the natural sciences.
Of course.
They want that precision. They want the prestige. They want to be able to say, we've conclusively demonstrated X or Y or Z, and we can do that. Now, how much of that, certainly that's their conceit, I would say, without question, and point two would be they didn't fulfill it. Economics being the most successful, but still, the dismal science and all that, it's done better than the others, but not great. How much of that, though, let's call it hubris, is the result of this, branch of philosophy thinking that it has refuted the older philosophic, because the older philosophic tradition had a kind of humility about it. So there are things that we can't know. There are things that are always going to be maybes, either-ors, 49-51 calls and things like that. So how much of it is hubris that they can overcome it, or how much of it is just like we're just blazing a new path because look at where we are, and after 2,000 years, we haven't solved these problems?
No, I think the first thing that they take for granted, which was the Hegelian framework of the end of history, that history itself means that the problems that the whole philosophic tradition denied could ever result in genuine knowledge about things. Hegel's analysis is philosophy is over because it has revealed itself, it's completed itself, and in the completion of philosophy, now you have genuine wisdom or knowledge, but that knowledge is going to be scientific knowledge.
Right. That's what I mean by the hubris, right?
Well,
no prior thinker would have said, "I can achieve," or humankind at all can achieve wisdom. So we all have to rein in our expectations a bit. And so I want to move, sort of steer towards some of the practical considerations of how this comes about. I can rattle a few of them off. One is government, and also the people government serves. They tend to come to think, well, we can put a man on. The old saying, if you can put a man on the moon, why can't you do X or Y or Z? So they tend to have these visionary expectations for what rational politics can achieve, because the whole argument in the first place is on a shaky foundation. It's not achieved, and we still spend a lot on it, and we don't get what we want, and everybody gets more unhappy. The other one that I really want you to talk about, because I think it has a very direct bearing on 2016, is government stops being political in the sense that you may want a tariff, I may want free trade, but I don't, in the older understanding, I don't say I have scientific proof that I'm right. Neither do you. We just go and argue it out, and somebody wins, somebody loses, or we make a compromise. Instead, it becomes a matter of incorrect versus correct, and no matter what the people vote for, the administrative state has such a weight and momentum that it just keeps doing what's always been done, and you get this massive frustration for people who want to rule themselves politically but feel like they can't. And that's, I think, going on here. I think that's going on in Europe. And that's.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. But here's the point in which that reveals itself politically within the regime is when Congress, as a body, as a legislative representative body, was meant to be a deliberative body, which means that it publicly deliberated on the kinds of issues that you're talking about, which meant then that that legislation or lawmaking was the activity of deliberation, representation of interests, and the various ways in which Congress, as a public body, came to some kind of compromise about what it is that could be established in law. And so general law is the product of deliberation, or rational deliberation is how it is that representative regimes establish political rule. When Congress gave up its power to legislate and began to delegate its authority to these agents, these technical and expert knowledge agencies and mechanisms, the whole character of the regime changed, and the legislative body became an oversight body. And it just paved the way really to make it possible for the legislative branch really to become much more adept at representing organized interests rather than pursuing a common good that would result in the ability to establish a consensus, political consensus, that people can live with by election.
So that brings me to two questions then. The first is, I just want to ask, why did Congress do that? Why would politicians supposedly want power, and if you have the power to write laws or defeat laws, you'd think you'd rather have that than give up your power and delegate it downward. Now, the obvious answer that most people give is, Well, it's hard to take controversial positions. They can be used against you in your reelection campaign. Just much easier to defer all that stuff, not get pinned down on anything and do constituent service. Is it that simple? Or is there a larger reason why they gave up their power? And the second question is, as you point out in the book, and I've heard you say many times, Congress moved from being a legislative body to an oversight body, but you point out they're not even a very good oversight body. No, they don't use their remaining oversight powers nearly as forcefully and as strongly as they could. They hang back, even with the one power that they sort of ostensibly have left. Why is that?
Well, I think what happened in the mid-'60s is that when the whole of the 20th century in a certain way, and this is progressive intellectual social science authority that established the way in which it was thought that the powers of the executive of the American government ought to be used. And the executive branch, almost all social science put their hopes on the presidency to establish a larger role in the economy, in society, from the center. The reason why Congress was reluctant is it always thought of its power in terms of its state base. And so Congress represented constituencies and states and localities, and so you had an active political life within the states. Congress never was tempted to think, or never thought that it could deliver better from the center to the periphery. In other words, that once they realized that if they brought great power and could compete with the executive, with the president, that they too would have a major role to play. People like Samuel Huntington in 1965 was writing, if Congress doesn't begin to participate in national politics, administrative politics, it's not going to have a role to play. All the power is going to go to the executive branch. And they were all calling for reform of the legislative branch. And what that required, of course, was that, and the reason why the reason why Congress would not do legislate and delegate its power, it refrained from using power, making laws that would establish those agencies. Once it decided that it would create those agencies, it really understood by 1970 that they had to change the way Congress understood its role. The Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970 established large staffs. It basically adapted itself to the role of oversight. Now, you're right, oversight in the 70s and 80s, certainly all the way into the 90s, when Congress was more decentralized as a body and allowed members to be subcommittee chairs, committee chairs, that oversaw the whole of the far-flung bureaucracy, it broke it down. And what that required, though, was that those subcommittee chairs have great power and be able to monitor these things that they were chair of over the course of a fiscal year. They could all then participate in the markups and the budgeting, the budget making of those agencies. And when those subcommittee chairs were on those committees long enough, they had as much knowledge about what that agency was doing as the experts. Once they gave that up, once they started centralizing power in the leadership in Congress, and it changed the character, and it's much harder now for them to provide oversight. And what it's done is it's narrowed the number of people who actually participate finally in what the budgets are, because really the budgets aren't made by and coordinated by members of the legislature. They're made by the bureaucracy. And when the bureaucracy gives essentially what its requests are, then you've got just a few leaders at the top that determine what it is that's going to be funded and what isn't. The membership either goes along or they have to shut the government. So it's just the worst way of doing almost anything.
I think the way I put it in the review is that Congress sort of willingly accepted for itself the status of junior partner to the administrative state. It's handmaiden and enabler. But the next question, I'm going to change topics, because to me, the essay that stuck out for me the most and I think it's because I hadn't read it before and I'd read a lot of the rest of the book before, was the essay on Nixon. And so I'll briefly summarize this. I think it was written first in 1982, so 8 years after Watergate, only published about 8 or 10 years after that.
Yeah.
And it, the first glance, you're getting a little kind of Art Bell late night radio feel here, cue the spooky music, is this man crazy? But when you think about it, the case, at least to me, started to appear convincing. And it essentially argues that the real deep undercurrent of Watergate was the administrative state figuring out that Nixon's second term was a real threat and we got to find a way to get rid of this guy. And you start connecting all the dots of what the administrative state did, or its various, and we know that Deep Throat, for instance, was the #2 man in the FBI. That was disclosed to the world in 2006, I think. Anyway, I came away from that feeling like I really learned something new and had a very fresh perspective. And also, talk about relevance. So I'd like to hear you.
Yeah, what I thought, it was really hard to make sense of Watergate during the time it was going on, partly because it was shaped as a legal problem. And at the bottom of it, of course, was a political problem that revealed itself far before Watergate. And that was this. The two branches, and particularly after Nixon won in '72, they didn't have a common ground by which to relate to each other, the executive and the legislative branch. And what that means is that the problem with the administrative state is that it had become impossible for both branches to participate equally, either if it wanted to be a constitutional body, say the president wanted to act in a constitutional way, on the one hand, and the other part of it was Congress had adapted itself to the administrative state, but nobody understood at that time that in accepting the legitimacy of the administrative state, you had abandoned the necessity of establishing separation of powers as a viable way of working our national government. The national government has two political branches. Both have to protect their turf. The legislature protects the legislative branch and the executive. Both have to protect their turf, but both have to understand that the defense of their institution is first a defense of the institution, but secondly, a participation in deciding what the common good is. So Congress has a perspective on lawmaking and what the common good is from the legislature's point of view, and the executive from the executive, but they have to cooperate. And once the administrative state established itself and its legitimacy and was constantly trying to expand itself, it became clear to Nixon that you could not have an administrative state and consent of the governed at the same time. He thought political rule would not be possible in the future if the administrative state established itself fully and established itself in a manner in which the legislative branch was really representative of interests rather than the possibility of determining what a common good is. And so when I wrote that thing, it was entitled at the time, Politics, Rhetoric, and Legitimacy, the Role of Bureaucracy in the Watergate Affair. Because it seemed to me that was whoever controlled the bureaucracy. The fight was who's going to control the bureaucracy. And Congress had great tools to control the bureaucracy. And when they came up against Nixon, who didn't abide by what they thought the rules were, then there was some very great changes that occurred in the Nixon administration, particularly in the second administration. They passed the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act because they wanted their own organized intelligence as to how to put the budget together rather than depending on OMB, which was in the hands of the executive. They passed campaign finance reform, War Powers Acts. All of these were to me, revelations that the two branches were not on the same page. I mean, from 1921, when you could say we created the Bureau of the Budget and all of those administrations in between, Congress never wanted to participate in control of the budget until Nixon's second term. And they realized that Nixon was going to use the budget to undermine the connection between Congress and the administrative state. So I thought it was, it was not, first of all, the Republicans in Congress did not see this in a partisan way. They didn't see it even, they understood it in an institutional way, but not a constitutional way, really. What they understood was, in an institutional way, was that they had made their accommodations, Republicans and Democrats, with the administrative state, with the interests. And Nixon was a threat to that. And so it wasn't partisan in the sense that Nixon could count on a party in Congress to uphold his view of what the Constitution was. And so it was really not easy to see what the role of the administrative state was, because it was only starting to get rolling.
But I mean, we could see it in hindsight, thanks to that piece, and we certainly see it in action now. I mean, if you think about what the administrative state, I mean, honestly, compared to what it's doing to Trump, it seems like they really treated Nixon with kid gloves. The amount of leaking, the amount of leaking to undermine the president, I'll be so bold as to say, as far as I can tell, who knows what the special prosecutor may or may not have, but the whole Russia thing looks like a complete setup designed to hamstring and undermine the president. You have, whatever you think of his policies, no president has ever faced this level of internal and external, but especially internal opposition. It's almost like the administrative state is just on strike, waiting him out, either doing what they want to do without him or just not doing the things they don't want to do. I mean, to the point where, and I realize that this was apparently a political appointee, but it gets you to the spirit of the thing. You have an anonymous op-ed writer in the New York Times saying, I'm in the administration and I'm doing everything I can to stop it from doing what it was elected to do. So, boy, it seems a lot more powerful now than it did even then. And if it brought down one president then, what are the prospects for this one now?
But we didn't know at the time that for one, nobody suspected that the Justice Department and federal judges, Jeff Shepard, who was one of Nixon's lawyers at the time, now with the benefit of freedom of information and people dying and getting all the records, you read his book on what happened in Watergate. Nixon didn't know what hit him in terms of the Justice Department acted in a completely unprofessional way. The judge Sirica was having private conferences with the prosecutors. All of the things that nobody would have suspected at the time, because we thought that the Justice Department established its behavior by the rule of law. What we didn't realize then was, what I think we came to realize is those agencies and departments that were constructed on technical expertise and professionalism, they viewed their professional duty as paramount to even the Constitution or the country. And so the Justice Department became, I mean, now it's clear. It's pretty clear that the Justice Department does have a defense of itself. The agencies have defenses of themselves. And I think when Comey says he's writing about a higher loyalty, he believes that. Professionalism means that your loyalty is to the knowledge you have. And these people that are trying to undermine you, these ignorant people, people that still want politics to rule rather than professionalism.
So it's hard to say then, I mean, which is more dangerous and insidious, that, the anti-democratic cabal element or aspect of the administrative state, or the way in which the administrative state saps the virtue, initiative, whatever you want to call it, for self-government and Republican rule by just sort of taking over little tasks and life. I mean, Tocqueville certainly talked about that. Yeah. Founders worried about it. You haven't said as much about the latter, but I think that, to me, that's the vast majority of what the federal behemoth does is not try to kick out incumbent presidents. They would not have tried to kick out President Clinton, Hillary Clinton, that's for sure. But no matter who's the president, that second aspect of it just goes on and grows by the day.
No, and I think when you look at the presidents in the post administrative state, because I date the effects of the administrative state as undermining the Constitution, as not the New Deal period. I think it's between 1965 and 75 that it happens when Congress reorganizes itself and establishes itself as a different body. And so there were only, in my view, only two presidents who understood that political rule was incompatible with administrative rule. Nixon was the first, and again, there's not great clarity in his mind about this, I know that. But Reagan also understood it. But Reagan learned from Nixon, you couldn't attack Congress directly. In other words, Reagan's, I think, greatest success was mobilizing public opinion on the question of whether or not government's a solution to the problem or is the problem. And that resonated. It resonated very effectively in the electorate, because when you look by the end of the 1980s, Reagan had in some ways delegitimized what FDR had called liberalism, which was a form of progressivism. And when they gave up, when the Democratic Party, realizing that they didn't want that label of liberalism, what did they turn to? They went back to what they had at the beginning of the century, what Wilson and all of them thought they were, progressives. Hillary calls herself a progressive in the 90s. Obama calls himself a progressive. That was Reagan's success. But everything he did in a kind of indirect way to try to minimize the effects of use executive power to minimize the power of the administrative state, which he did fairly effectively through reconciliation, the OIRA, those kinds of things were fairly effective. But by the 90s, when Clinton comes along, he realizes you could use those tools that Reagan used to minimize the power of the administrative state and actually use executive power on behalf of the administrative state. And as Congress legislates more and more power to the administrative body, it of necessity gives greater power to the executive and more discretionary power to the executive. Because when an activity is not made by law, but it's done by administrative rulemaking, then of course Congress can't participate in the same way as the executive branch can in figuring out in discretionary in terms of discretion how they want to administer those particular things. So there's no way out of the administrative state in a certain way of extending greater power to the executive and greater discretion to the executive. And so they all now use executive authority, many ways in which the use of executive orders or signing statements, all of those things are just ways in which presidents are trying to administer these things, these policies that are established.
But you're being somewhat generous, right, when you say it goes into the executive branch. I mean, it does and it doesn't. On the flow chart, this power goes into the executive branch.
Yeah.
But in reality, if you define the executive branch as the elected president, the confirmed members of the Senate confirmed members of administration, and then his senior staff at the White House, they can't really control the rulemaking bodies of the fourth branch either.
I didn't mean the political people.
Yeah.
I meant the executive branch, which is part of the bureaucracy.
So yeah, I guess.
So yeah, it's much harder for the political. Nixon saw this too. I mean, he already saw that when he said, I appoint people to these offices that are expected to take a presidential view, and what do? They go native and they become part of the bureaucracy co-opts them. because there's no incentive for a political appointee to go into a big agency and be a threat to the people that have the institutional knowledge in those agencies. The only way you succeed is to accommodate them. And Nixon was trying to say, we want somebody that can rule those, but you can't do it. It's not easily done. What I'm saying is, political rule is not compatible with administrative rule. And political rule is about lawmaking. And administrative rule is about rulemaking. And that means that all of the participants who are affected by rules have a greater stake in Washington and want to participate, either to get advantage or subsidies or relief of one kind or another. And so it's a good town for organized interest. It's a good town for organized interest, but it's not very good for what one would call establishing what the public good is. What's the common good that these institutions are created for in the first place? I mean, when you think about it, these are offices that are created by the Constitution on behalf of the people. If they don't do what they're supposed to do, like make laws and deliberate and establish, once they make a law, that the rule falls equal, those laws fall equally on everybody, then you start establishing the rule of privilege. You start allowing privilege to dominate. And there's many, many kinds of privilege that are available in all of these areas, including, of course, the privilege that comes out of the Justice Department deciding who they will prosecute and who they won't. That's not, nobody could say that is compatible with rule of law.
I said before, the administrative state, I think I used the word seems, which is preposterous. Of course, it is far larger than even it was when it became, when Nixon put it in his sights, when Reagan was worrying about it. Nothing seems to be able to check its growth, either as a physical matter, just in terms of the number of people and the amount of money it spends, or in its reach. So the Trump election was in part, he never used the phrase, but it was clear that on some, and you were the one who turned, I say this in the review, you figured this out before the rest of us and were trying to tell us in the very early stages of the primary campaign. On some intuitive level, he figured that out, ran against it. I think he wants to stop it. But is this boulder just so heavy and the hill so steep that nobody can stop it?
Well, I don't know. I think the reason why I had confidence, and I don't say in Trump the person, I knew nothing about Trump. I just thought, this guy is entering this race, and his perspective is not the perspective either of an intellectual, a social scientist, a Washington insider. It's a perspective of a citizen. It was a perspective of a commonsensical view of what politics should be. And the problem with the administrative state is, just think of all the organized intelligence that's been produced in the last 50 years, 100 years in the American university. Where does it all go? It really comes to Washington, right? And these people have an interest then in utilizing that knowledge. Now, I think the real question here is the one you asked before. Is this real knowledge? If it's real knowledge, things should have been getting better all along. But it's not so clear that things have been getting better. And in the eyes of citizens who just judge the regime on the basis of the political character of it, they think it's getting worse. And so this is going to be, you have in a way a kind of caste that establishes its authority in Washington through the credentials that it has, that are established by these universities that are supposedly establishing the kind of knowledge about whether it's foreign policy, domestic policy, economics, social problems. All of these create a huge interest that is, I hate to call it it's an interest that is oblivious to the fact that it also has its own self-interest at stake. In other words, it thinks that it's doing a good that can't be judged in political terms.
It is. I made that point too in the review, that it's convinced, you bring this out, it's convinced of its own impartiality. It's very earnest in the way it understands itself. So I've been in the government a couple times, and you will always hear anytime the government or some part of it does something, I think the words that I used were venal, partisan, stupid, or punitive, you can always count on permanent Washington to rise and go on cable TV with one voice and say, hey, these are just honest career civil servants doing their jobs. Don't criticize them. And I worked with so many of these people, and of course that's true in almost every case. These are honest career civil servants just doing their jobs. The problem is precisely that they're very, very earnest, and they are, most of them, convinced that they're maybe not in possession of wisdom, but they know the truth of the subject matter they're there for.
Yeah.
There's a disdain of political disagreement and a sense that my task is implementation and not to be, bickering maybe back and forth between these different views. That's not political rule in any sense, really.
Yeah. But also, I think there's one other element of the administrative state. It does have an intellectual and moral defense of itself. And the people who were morally, let's say, believe that organized intelligence is bringing us into the future, and the future is where we're striving to get, they're of the opinion, of course, that the Constitution and political rule is an obstacle to that. So it's a good for them. I mean, and you can't discount the fact that many people think that that the old regime, the Constitution, was immoral, unjust. And so the moral character of postmodernism, which establishes, I think, kind of moral authority for the administrative state as it now understands itself, you're at war really between an older America and what America can become.
Baked into the cake in a sense from the beginning, the very earliest progressives. Although we get the Constitution is immoral later. That emerges, I think, more in the mid-20th century. The initial argument is it's just outmoded. It's not fit. Society's gotten too complex. We can't govern ourselves with these powdered wigs anymore. So we have to move, and the American people in their foolishness or sentimentality are attached to it. So we're not going to tell them that we're just going to maneuver around it, under it, and over it, and pretend like we adhere to it. All right, so I think with that, we're going to take some audience questions. Sorry.
I'm told that in the, and I hate to use the term, Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, there were 1,065 places where it said, the secretary shall, talking about delegation. The second part of that would be, are you familiar with the work being done at the Scalia Law School of George Mason, who've been holding conferences on just this subject of delegation?
I'll say just very quickly on the first point, every law is like that now. No laws are laws. Laws are not laws. And there's still 2,000 pages, but then the 2,000 pages are just 2,000 pages of the secretary shall, which really doesn't mean the secretary. It means the permanent bureaucracy underneath the secretary. And then they write, for a 2,000-page law, they write 15 or 30,000 pages worth of rules that are the real laws.
Well, Nancy Pelosi was right when she was asked, what's in the law? And she says, well, I can't tell you that until after it starts to get administered. I mean, because these are works in progress, but the knowledge to be able to establish these rules are all within the experts. And there was, I forget, one of the senators saying at the time when they asked him if he had read the law, and he says, well, I don't think you want me to waste my time reading these laws. He says, I have experts to read this for me. And so Congress is, well, this is the way these things are viewed, and
they're also so long. I don't know that any. You have 48 hours to comment on 2,000 pages, and it's just kind of okay.
So I think you guys both talked about maybe the failure of politics, either since the 1960s or perhaps even going back from that, to restrain the administrative state and to bring politics restrain that state. And I think we see that, for example, in Reagan being unable to eliminate the Department of Education, even though it had only been around for a year when he started trying. What about trying to bring politics to the administrative state? We've danced around the distinction between career and appointment. Is it time to make the case to the American people that we need to roll back some of those career protections, those job protections, and make them directly accountable to elected officials, i.e. the president?
I'd certainly be for that. I mean, keep in mind too, just very briefly, John, I don't want to.
Yeah, go
but our system actually, compared to a parliamentary system typical in Europe, has a far deeper layers of political appointees. So when the British look at the State Department and they see, wow, president gets to appoint people all the way down to this assistant and sometimes even the deputy assistant level. We have a minister and two guys and that's it. Amazing. You must have much greater control over your government than we ever could. And maybe the joke is on them in that sense. So I'd be all for it with one caveat, which is if we have to get every single one of those people confirmed through the Senate, they're just going to be empty chairs. And the impulse of conservatives, myself included, sometimes might be empty chairs in the federal government. Great. What's the problem, right? Feature, not bug, except that you can't politically control, as this administration is finding to its frustration, in part because of so much Senate obstructionism, Democratic obstructionism in particular, you can't really control these agencies without your veneer of people, whether that's the top 3 layers or the top 6 layers. You've got to have people, and if the Senate has the power to hold them up, it's not going to work. I don't know if you have anything to...
No, I think the problem with centralized administration is that once it's centralized, every interest, once all the activity of human life becomes political, there's no interest that doesn't organize and mobilize itself around Washington. It can be social, economic, scientific, religious. There's really no realm of human activity that's immune to political control in the modern administrative state. And so when you have that kind of, the pervasive character of the administrative state, these interests mobilize, they come to Washington, they have a presence in Washington to try to decrease the power and the connections between those organized interests and the bureaucracy and the legislative branch is it's a very difficult task. It's hard to believe, but in 1964, if you had come to Washington, you would have found hardly any national, economic, social interest that had a Washington office or Washington lobbyist. That meant that still there was active political, economic, and social life in states, or companies had to, if they wanted to lobby within the state, they went to Albany and New York or whatever the state capital. When you centralize everything, everybody wants to make one decision, right? Including the people. If we make it in Washington, then what do the states become? They become ciphers of the federal government. And their role really is to just administer what is done here. Nobody who's ambitious, who should be perhaps in a state participating in making local and political rule in states better, they come here. They use their talent here. We don't have a way of having good political and social and intellectual life outside of Washington. Even whatever it is in the periphery, like Hollywood or business in New York, it's all organized around Washington. So it's really hard to, Tocqueville was right, don't decentralize if you can help. I mean, don't centralize
if you can help it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
We tend to know now, or suspect at least, that incumbent players in the private sector, incumbent industries, or businesses in an industry have an incentive to favor regulation. It keeps the upstarts who don't understand them out. Mm-hmm. What are possible countervailing incentives that Congress can set up that would work against, work to corrode the power of the administrative state?
Well, And it's difficult to say. I mean, once the big companies have complied with the rigors of the administrative state, and those costs then are factored in. It's how do you any upstart company, if you'd have to deregulate in a way that made the newer players not have to play the game, but nobody's going to do that. Congress is not going to do that, I don't think. Do you have a sense of what you could do?
No, you're right that Congress, it's still somewhat mystifying to me why. I mean, the system, our system of government, our Constitution only works if ambition counteracts ambition, as Madison put it. And Congress doesn't seem to have any ambition anymore, right?
No.
Where did that go? Why did they cede it? Why did it drain out of them? Because boy, the administrative state's pretty ambitious. The judiciary's pretty ambitious. But Congress seems to just be perfectly happy with being, I mean, irrelevant, maybe a kind of a harsh word, but not that relevant. And when it is relevant, it tends to just take its cues from the executive. Like the president of either party says, I want this law, you get it, you get me 51 votes, and go pass it. They almost never take the initiative to pass, I mean, do they ever pass legislation by their own initiative anymore?
Well, it's rare, but you have to think, they have a great deal of protection, security. They have a great deal of power in terms of patronage to all kinds of things, and they have something that in politics could never be secure. Political life is precarious, but administrative life is safe. In a way, you could say they're just like bureaucrats.
Yeah.
When I did the book called The Imperial Congress about 30 years ago, what we showed was that it was as hard to defeat an incumbent in Congress in the 1970s and 80s. Yeah. They had as much safety as the Soviet Politburo people did. So, I mean, it was...
And it's much harder now, for the most part, right? Because of gerrymandering and what social science is so-called the big sort, where blue districts just get bluer, red ones get redder, so you have fewer competitive... That must be part of the explanation, that you have fewer competitive districts almost every cycle, and the margin shrinks. And so if you're safe, you're going to play for the long term and think about how you can boost your fundraising and how you can serve this constituency or this interest group and so on, and not think about... not think about the common good or why you're really there or you're supposed to be there.
I think one thing, too, that made it harder in the 21st century and really in the last decade of the 20th was the end of the Cold War, because there were various constraints that were imposed on the American political order and the offices that were established simply by the necessities of the Cold War. I mean, there were rational limits as to what American policymakers could do. The end of the Cold War and this euphoria about a global order meant, in a certain way, that they could become global in their perspective about how to think. And also these administrative structures, by the way, that are established are not just national. They're put together by professions, by expertise, the non-governmental organizations, economic organizations. Large-scale economic organizations are as bureaucratic as government is in the structures. So that's a lot of temptation.
You know, you made a great point in the book, and since you brought up the end of the Cold War, that it really revealed Congress's failure and almost impotence, that Cold War is over, the military is going to downsize. We're going to, I'm from California. We had a lot of military bases in California. Many of them closed, which contributed greatly to the early 90s recession. But Congress couldn't find the will to deliberate amongst itself to say, what's the best for the nation? Do we need this base? Do we not need that base? Everybody just wanted to protect the one in his district, no matter what. And so they had to outsource it to the base closing commission. The very process, I mean, here's a fundamental purpose that they should have been able to do, that they're constitutionally elected to do. They couldn't do it, so they outsourced it. And that was, in hindsight, as you point out, I mean, I'm sure you understood it at the time. I didn't. In hindsight, reading about it in the book, wow, that's a blinking red light about Congress's failure, isn't it?
Yeah, it's when you think about how much Congress has delegated in ways that make it easier for them to avoid political problems that pose threats to reelection. You notice how apt they are to, when it's a controversial issue, they'll let the courts decide it. There's always ways in which it's like when you talk about ambition, I've said for a long time, the American founders, Hamilton and Madison would say, there's not enough ambition to run this government now. Political ambition, real political ambition, with a view toward political ambition means that you desire political greatness. And that's just not what animates these people. I mean, when a senator, like my senator from Nevada, who was just as much concerned with the sewer systems of Nevada as he was with the big questions, it means that these people they just want, they want to manage affairs. They want the control. Rational rule is not political rule, but it does presuppose the necessity of managing affairs. And when you manage affairs through every phase. There's no necessity to determine whether something's successful or not. If it doesn't work, you continue to manage it. If it works and you manage it and it won't work at a certain point, you still manage it. That's why when McConnell said getting out of Afghanistan is precipitous now, what he really meant was we've managed the affairs there, and we've got a lot of contractors and NGOs and people that work there and have, we've got a presence there. We need to keep that managed.
Yeah, in a particularly passage that stuck out for me, I don't remember it word for word, but it's a paragraph sort of late in the book. You talk about just the complete lack of accountability for anything. No failure is ever acknowledged, no mistake is ever corrected, no course is ever changed, and nobody talks about it. And finally, Trump comes along and starts saying, wow, you really failed. You don't know what you're doing. That was a disaster. People are saying, you're violating the rules of Washington. You're not supposed to call us failures, even though we manifestly are. Anyway, I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
What's to prevent, in the unlikely scenario that Congress actually takes back some of its power from the administrative state, what's to prevent it from becoming or allowing its staff to become just as powerful or numerous as sort of what we see as the administrative state? So what's to prevent that sort of same bureaucracy occurring within the legislative branch rather than the executive?
Well, I think that the first thing is if they do things in the open, then they're vulnerable at the polls too. And so, the real trick is to be able to win offices by not appearing to be political. In other words, you simply service needs, you service constituencies. When you start getting political, no matter what the issue is, you're going to antagonize half the people that don't agree with the position you take. So the goal is they have power in the staffs over the areas in which they want to have power, but they don't want transparency in the sense that a congressman or a senator is known for his political views, and because that makes you vulnerable again. And so it's much harder now to get them to act politically. So to take power back in a political way, if they wouldn't really want, they have staffs. Their staffs really are administrative staffs. Their staffs are, well, when you think about it, when Roosevelt created the executive office of the presidency in 1939, the commission that did a study of it said Roosevelt needs some help, and he didn't have any really personal, any private staff that was devoted to the particular areas of expertise over which he could have some advisors. And when they said they recommended that he have, a half a dozen maybe advisors that just worked for him, the president. There was no expert staff that was given to the president until 1939. When a Senate Majority Leader like Harry Reid, when he was Majority Leader, he probably had a staff of 100, 150. That's not a legislator, that's an executive office. That's a small little office. It's an executive office, and there's hundreds of them in the legislative, in those arenas. So the staffs really are necessary to equip one branch to be able to participate when it's necessary to confront another branch. That's what was happening even by Nixon's time. You could see that when Congress creates the bureaucracy to mirror its committee structure. And of course, so it has great control over the actual bureaucracies of the departments, or at least it did in that time. So when Nixon, just as an example, when Nixon decided that he was going to do the opening to China, the first thing he did was refuse to let Secretary of State Rogers know that he was doing anything. Everything that Nixon did with China was done through the National Security Council in the executive branch. Because Nixon knew, if it got into the State Department, Congress would know it right away and would blow up the
And by the way, Nixon's NSC, Kissinger's NSC was maybe 40 people, 60 tops. It's got to be 300 today. So if FDR was allowed 6 EOP staff in 1939, I think the total EOP right now is about 3,600.
Oh yeah, no, but when you see, that means that the separation of powers doesn't work the way it was intended to constitutionally. Because both branches should be cooperating on behalf of what is a national interest, a public good for the nation. Now, yeah, they should defend their turf as a legislature or the executive, but that's not what they're doing anymore. Yeah. Now they're trying to determine how it is that you can control where the real power of government is, which is in the administrative structure.
I guess I would answer your question the same way, but more glibly, which is even if what you suggested were to come to pass, it would be better than what we have now.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. The book, again, is Unmasking the Administrative State. He's going to be signing copies and the reception to follow. And I'd also like to take a moment to recognize the fine editor of this volume, Ken Masugi, who's here as well. So, Ken.
Yeah, Ken is here.
Thanks to the Claremont Institute, which is the co-sponsor for our event this evening, and I look forward to seeing you at the next Hillsdale College event. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.